So in chapter 42, Joseph comes face to face with his brothers who sold him into slavery when he was 17 years old. It's been more than 20 years since Joseph last saw his brothers, that terrible day when they sold him. Joseph is now the second most powerful man in Egypt. And the Middle East is in the midst of a 7-year famine. Because of Joseph's wisdom, Egypt prepared for the 7 years of famine by storing up food during the 7 years of plenty. So there's an abundance of grain in Egypt. God put Joseph in this position in Egypt to not only save Egypt, but more importantly, to save his family, Israel. And it's from his family, Israel, that the Savior of the world, Jesus Christ, will one day come. And so God is preserving his plan of salvation here through Joseph. This 7-year famine is a picture or a type of the 7 years of tribulation that will come upon the earth at the end of the age. The tribulation will be a 7-year period when God will pour out his wrath upon this world because of this world's rebellion against God. And the tribulation is described in detail in Revelation chapters 6 to 19. And this is a picture of that. This is a type of it here in Genesis. Just as the brothers of Joseph go to Joseph for salvation during the 7 years of famine, and Joseph's true identity is revealed to his brothers during the 7 years of tribulation that will come, the Jewish people will turn to Jesus Christ for salvation. And they will finally realize that Jesus Christ is their Messiah. And they'll put their faith and trust in him. And so Joseph is a picture of Christ. In Acts chapter 7, verses 9 to 13, there Stephen is giving a sermon, and he's going through Israel's history, and he's pointing out in his sermon how quite often in the Old Testament the Jewish people would reject a Savior that God would send to them the first time, and then receive that same Savior a second time. The second time the Savior appears. And he mentions Joseph in Acts chapter 7. He says, "And the patriarchs, becoming envious, sold Joseph into Egypt. But God was with him and delivered him out of all of his troubles and gave him favor and wisdom in the presence of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And he made him governor over Egypt and all his house. And now a famine and great trouble came over all the land of Egypt and Canaan, and our fathers found no sustenance. But when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent out our fathers first. And the second time Joseph was made known to his brothers. Joseph's family became known to Pharaoh." Joseph was despised and rejected by his brothers, but during the 7-year famine, Joseph was made known to his brothers, and he saved his brothers. Jesus was despised and rejected by his brothers, the Jewish people, but he will be made known to them during the tribulation period and will save them. Romans 11 says, "And all Israel will be saved during that time." Now, verse 1 tells us how the brothers of Joseph came down to Egypt. Look at verse 1 again. It says, "When Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, 'Why do you look at one another?' And he said, 'Indeed, I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down to that place and buy for us there, that we may live and not die.' There was no food in Canaan because of the famine. And Jacob said to his sons, 'Why are you looking at each other? Go down to Egypt and buy us some food before we die.'" Spoken like a true father to his sons, right? "What are you just sitting there for? Looking at each other. Do something." Jacob will make a few kind of dad statements in this chapter that are kind of funny, I think. But I don't want you to miss what is happening here in verse 1 with the sons of Jacob. Again, there's a famine in the land. They're starving. They're going to die if they don't get some food soon. And what are the sons of Jacob doing? They're just sitting there looking at each other. In other words, they are not doing anything to address the problem. They got a big problem here. And they're not doing anything to address the problem. They're just looking at each other, paralyzed by the famine, hoping something changes, hoping things improve, but they're not taking action to change anything or to solve the problem. And sometimes we can do the same thing. Sometimes we can do the same thing where we find ourselves in a situation that is maybe harmful or toxic or destructive. It's like a famine of sorts that is slowly sucking the life out of us, and we don't do anything about it. We don't do anything to try to change it. We just stay in the same place. We just stay in the famine. And you know people like that. You know someone that every time you talk to them, they tell you about the same old problem that they've always had. They tell you about the famine. And you realize that, man, they're not doing anything to try to fix their situation. They're not doing anything to try to change their circumstances. And every time you see them and talk to them, they just tell you more about the famine. No, I asked you about your family, not your famine. I just, And it can be draining on you, too. Like, oh, here comes that person. Oh, I got to hear what's going on now with this. But they're not even trying to do anything to get out of it. I think a good question to ask that person is, well, what are you doing to solve this problem? What changes are you making? How are you addressing this? So Joseph's 10 brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt, but Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he said, lest some calamity befall him. This is another funny thing for Jacob to say. You boys can go, but Benjamin, your brother's going to stay here because I don't want anything bad to happen to him. Well, what about us, Dad? I mean, come on. Jacob keeps Benjamin home because Joseph and Benjamin were the only two sons of Jacob and Rachel. And Rachel has passed away. Jacob believes that Joseph is dead. And so Benjamin is the only family left from his marriage to Rachel, and he doesn't want anything to happen to Benjamin. And so he says, Benjamin can't go. He's going to stay. I don't want to take any risks with something happening to Benjamin, so you boys go. Your brother Benjamin, the youngest son, he's going to stay.